Hey there. Before you drift off, welcome to your adult bedtime story. Behind what looks like an ordinary event lies a truth that was never meant to be heard. And tonight, I'm going to tell it to you. Wherever you're watching from and whatever time it is, thanks for being here. If you enjoy strange, dark, and mysterious stories, don't forget to subscribe. What police found inside that locked motel room. The motel sat just off a two-lane highway that most travelers barely remembered after passing through. It catered to truck drivers, construction crews, and people who preferred not to be noticed. The building was old but functional, with exterior hallways, faded paint, and a neon sign that buzzed inconsistently after dark. On the afternoon police arrived, there was nothing outwardly unusual. Cars were parked in uneven lines, a television played behind the front desk. Room 28 looked exactly like every other room along the row. The request that brought officers to the motel was routine. The manager had grown uneasy after several unanswered calls to the room and a missed checkout deadline. The guest had always paid on time, always in cash, and had never caused problems. But 3 days without contact crossed a line. Motel policy discouraged staff from entering rooms alone under those circumstances. Law enforcement was contacted to perform a welfare check. Records showed the man checked in late on a weekday evening. He arrived alone, carrying one duffel bag and no visible luggage beyond that. He provided identification, signed the register, and asked for a room at the far end of the property. He did not request extra towels or housekeeping service. Within hours, the Do Not Disturb sign appeared on his door. None of this struck staff as unusual at the time. According to the clerk on duty that night, the man was polite but quiet. He did not make small talk. He did not appear intoxicated or agitated. He paid for one night, then returned the next morning to extend his stay. He did the same thing the following day, always before the cutoff time. That was the last direct interaction anyone at the motel would have with him. When officers arrived for the welfare check, it was early evening. The sky was dimming, and the parking lot lights had just come on. They approached room 28 and knocked several times, announcing themselves clearly. They waited between knocks, listening. There was no response, no footsteps, no sound from a television or radio. One officer noticed the air conditioning unit was running. The low mechanical hum suggested the room was still occupied or at least still powered. That detail was relayed over the radio. Officers knocked again, louder this time, still nothing. The motel manager provided a master key and stood back as instructed. When the key was turned, the door opened only a few inches before stopping abruptly. Something solid was pressed against it from the inside. This immediately elevated concern. Furniture blocking a door can indicate fear, distress, or an attempt to delay discovery. Officers repositioned themselves, drew their weapons, and forced the door open the rest of the way. The first thing visible was a dresser pulled from the wall and wedged directly behind the door. The carpet beneath it was scraped and frayed, showing it had been dragged with effort. Beyond it, the room was dim. The curtains were fully closed and pinned together, preventing any outside light from entering. The smell inside the room was faint but unmistakable. It wasn't overpowering, but it was enough for officers to recognize immediately that someone inside was likely deceased. They conducted a brief safety sweep, checking behind the curtains and inside the closet. No one else was present. The main area of the room showed signs of use, but not chaos. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled and pushed aside. A chair lay on its side near the small table. On that table were empty plastic water bottles and fast food wrappers. There were no broken items, no shattered glass, no visible blood. The bathroom light was on, spilling a dull glow into the room. Officers approached carefully and pulled back the shower curtain. Inside the bathtub lay the body of the man who had checked in days earlier. He was fully clothed. His body was positioned on its side, knees slightly bent. There was no water in the tub. Paramedics were called, but quickly confirmed the man was deceased. The room was secured, and detectives were requested. The motel manager was instructed to block off the surrounding rooms temporarily. Guests were told there was a maintenance issue. No further details were provided. As investigators arrived, the focus shifted to documentation. Photographs were taken of the dresser, the door, the room layout, and the body. The man's phone was found on the bathroom counter, powered off. His wallet was located inside the duffel bag near the bed. Cash and credit cards were still inside. The duffel bag contained clothing, toiletries, and prescription medication bottles labeled in the man's name. The quantities remaining did not immediately suggest overdose. There were no illegal substances in plain view. The mini fridge contained a single unopened beer. Windows were checked and found locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry on the door or window frames. The lock itself appeared intact and functional. The dresser blocking the door remained the most striking detail in the room. Based on body condition and environmental factors, investigators estimated the man had been dead for at least 2 days. The air conditioning had likely slowed decomposition, making precise time of death estimates difficult. An autopsy was ordered. Security footage from the motel was reviewed. Cameras covered the front desk and parking lot, but did not capture the exterior hallway directly outside room 28. The man was seen checking in and later walking to a vending machine that first night. After that, he did not appear on camera again. No visitors were recorded entering or leaving his room. Detectives began reconstructing a timeline. Cell phone records showed the man made one outgoing call shortly after midnight on the first night of his stay. The call lasted less than a minute. There were no further calls or messages. The number he dialed was registered to a prepaid phone and could not be easily traced. Interviews were conducted with motel staff and guests. Most reported nothing unusual. One guest recalled hearing a loud thump late at night, but dismissed it at the time. Another said he saw the man outside smoking near his room, alone, appearing tired but calm. The autopsy results added complexity rather than clarity. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no fractures, no defensive wounds. Toxicology revealed trace amounts of prescription medication and alcohol, but not at levels typically associated with fatal overdose. The cause of death was listed as undetermined, pending further investigation. Investigators returned repeatedly to the question of the barricaded door. If the man had moved the dresser himself, it suggested a deliberate act. But there was no note, no message on his phone, and no known history of paranoia or fear. Family members described him as private but stable. If someone else had been involved, investigators had to consider how they entered and exited the room without leaving evidence. The lack of camera coverage outside the room created a blind spot. The locked windows and intact door complicated theories of third-party involvement. The handwritten note found near the nightstand was analyzed but yielded little. It appeared to be a simple list of items, possibly reminders. There was no threatening language or farewell message. Handwriting matched samples provided by family. As weeks passed, leads dwindled. No one came forward with new information. The prepaid phone number remained unconnected to any known associates. Financial records showed no unusual transactions. There was no indication of robbery or extortion. The case slowly receded from public attention. There were no press conferences or major news coverage. Internally, the file remained open, categorized as an unexplained death. Detectives revisited it periodically, hoping for a new angle or overlooked detail. Room 28 was eventually cleaned and returned to service. New guests slept there, unaware of what had happened. The motel continued operating as it always had, just another stop along the highway. What happened inside that locked motel room remains unresolved. The evidence tells a partial story, but leaves critical gaps. Whether the man died alone by his own actions or whether someone else played a role is still unclear. The dresser behind the door remains the detail investigators cannot fully explain. The case remains open. The questions remain unanswered, and what police found inside that locked motel room continues to stand as a quiet reminder of how some deaths leave behind more uncertainty than truth. A missing persons case with conflicting timestamps. At first glance, the case appeared routine. A missing persons report filed late on a weekday afternoon, logged into the system without urgency, processed the same way thousands of others were each year. There were no alarms triggered, no immediate media attention, and no reason for investigators to believe this case would ever be remembered. Everything about it looked ordinary until someone noticed the timestamps. The report listed a single individual who had failed to return home after leaving work the previous evening. The name itself did not stand out, nor did the address or place of employment. According to the paperwork, the disappearance occurred sometime between 6:40 p.m. and 9 to 15 p.m., a window vague enough to be unremarkable. But within the digital record, the times did not agree with one another. The first anomaly appeared in the initial intake log. The report was officially submitted at 7:03 p.m., a full hour before the system claimed the individual was last seen. That alone should not have been possible. A missing persons report cannot proceed the moment someone goes missing, yet the system accepted the entry without error or warning. Investigators initially assumed the discrepancy was the result of a clerical mistake. Timestamps are adjusted manually in certain circumstances, especially when reports are filed under stress or confusion. But as they began reviewing the associated records, the inconsistencies multiplied instead of resolving. Each database reflected a different version of the same event, and none of them aligned. According to the local police department's case management software, the missing individual clocked out of work at 6:52 p.m. Security footage from the building's exit confirmed that detail. However, a separate access log from the parking garage recorded the person's vehicle leaving at 6:41 p.m., 11 minutes earlier. Both systems were synchronized daily, both were verified as functioning correctly, and neither showed signs of tampering. The contradictions did not stop there. Cell phone records indicated a brief outbound call at 7:18 p.m. placed from a location several miles away from the workplace. The call connected, lasted less than 20 seconds, and ended without voicemail. Yet traffic camera footage from the same time frame showed the vehicle still traveling in the opposite direction, entering a residential area where the phone signal should not have been present. By the end of the first review, investigators were no longer asking where the person went. They were trying to determine when the person had last existed in a single, consistent place. Every system told a slightly different story, and none of those stories could coexist. What made the situation more troubling was how confidently the systems reported their information. Each timestamp was precise, down to the second. Each record carried verification markers indicating it had been properly logged, synchronized, and archived. There were no flags, no error codes, and no missing fields. From a technical standpoint, the data was flawless. Human testimony only added another layer of confusion. Coworkers were certain they had spoken to the missing person after 7 p.m., recalling casual conversations that felt too specific to dismiss. A security guard insisted he remembered watching the individual exit the building closer to 7:10. None of these accounts could be proven, but none could be ruled out either. As the hours passed, the case file grew thicker while the timeline grew less stable. Each new piece of evidence seemed to overwrite the last without fully replacing it. Investigators began annotating their notes with qualifiers and uncertainties, something they were trained to avoid. A missing persons case depends on time more than almost anything else, and time was the one element this case refused to provide. By the following morning, the case had already developed an internal reputation, not because of its severity, but because of how resistant it was to basic reconstruction. Every attempt to establish a clear sequence of events resulted in contradictions that could not be resolved through standard procedure. The file looked complete, yet it behaved like something unfinished. At this stage, no one suspected foul play. No evidence suggested abduction, violence, or intent to disappear. The concern was quieter and harder to articulate. The records themselves were unreliable, not because they were missing, but because they all insisted on being correct at the same time. And that was only the beginning. By the second day, the investigation had shifted away from physical locations and toward databases and audit trails. Detectives began pulling records not to find where the missing person had gone, but to understand how many versions of the same evening could legally exist. Every system they accessed produced information that was internally consistent yet incompatible with the others. State-level records introduced another contradiction. A license plate reader along a highway corridor logged the missing person's vehicle at 7:26 p.m. traveling northbound. The timestamp was verified by the Department of Transportation and matched adjacent vehicle records. Yet, local traffic cameras placed the same vehicle at an intersection 15 miles south less than 4 minutes later. No route existed that could account for that movement without violating basic travel time. Investigators briefly considered data corruption. That theory was dismissed after a systems audit showed no errors, delays, or synchronization failures. The clocks across departments were aligned within milliseconds. Even backup servers reflected the same conflicting information. The data had not drifted over time, it had entered the system that way. Attempts to anchor the timeline to a single physical moment failed repeatedly. Gas station receipts, credit card transactions, and toll records either contradicted one another or appeared at times that overlapped impossibly. In one instance, a purchase appeared to be made after a toll crossing that had not yet occurred. Each record carried authentication markers, proving it had been generated in real time. Witness interviews offered no clarity. A neighbor reported seeing the missing person's car parked outside their residence shortly after sunset. Another witness, miles away, described a brief interaction at a convenience store around the same time. Both statements were logged separately, and neither could be corroborated or disproven. The witnesses did not know each other, and their accounts did not appear rehearsed or deceptive. As the case progressed, investigators noticed something unusual about how the records behaved. When queried individually, each database presented its information confidently. When cross-referenced, the contradictions intensified. It was as if the systems were never meant to be compared side by side. Each told a complete story, but only in isolation. Supervisors escalated the case to a regional review team, hoping an external perspective might identify a missed procedural explanation. The team reviewed the file and reached the same conclusion as the original investigators. There was no reliable starting point. Without a stable, last-known moment, the investigation could not move forward in a meaningful way. What unsettled the review team most was the absence of anomalies outside the timeline itself. No alarms were triggered, no fraud alerts appeared, no automated safeguards reacted to the contradictions. The systems accepted every record as legitimate. From an administrative standpoint, nothing was wrong. Internal notes from that period show a gradual change in language. Early entries focused on correcting errors. Later entries focused on documenting uncertainty. Investigators stopped trying to fix the timeline and began preserving it exactly as it appeared, aware that any adjustment would erase information that could not be recreated. Days passed, then weeks. Search efforts continued based on probability rather than certainty. Each decision required choosing one version of events over another, knowing that choice might be wrong. The case remained open, but it no longer behaved like a typical missing persons investigation. It had become a study in conflicting realities, all of them officially recorded. Eventually, the file was flagged for long-term review, not because of new evidence, but because of its unresolved structure. It could not be closed without establishing a timeline, and a timeline could not be established without discarding valid data. The case existed in a permanent state of suspension. By the time the investigation slowed, one fact was clear. The problem was no longer finding the missing person. The problem was determining when the disappearance actually began. Every answer depended on a time that refused to settle into a single truth. And somewhere within the systems that recorded it all, those times continued to coexist. Months after the disappearance, the case no longer appeared on active briefings. There were no new leads, no recovered evidence, and no confirmed sightings that could withstand verification. Search efforts gradually slowed, not because hope was lost, but because the case lacked a stable point of reference. Without a definitive timeline, every theory remained provisional. The file itself continued to grow. Periodic system updates preserved the conflicting timestamps rather than correcting them. Each migration copied the data exactly as it existed, preserving contradictions with the same precision as any resolved case. From a technical standpoint, the record was healthy. From an investigative standpoint, it was unusable. A final review attempted to reconcile the discrepancies by prioritizing one system over the others. That effort was abandoned after legal advisors warned that selectively favoring data could compromise the integrity of the entire record. If one verified timestamp could be dismissed without explanation, then all of them became questionable. The safest option was to leave the file untouched. Officially, the case remained open. Unofficially, it became a reference point during training sessions and internal discussions. New investigators were shown the file as an example of how certainty could dissolve even when information appeared complete. The lesson was never written down, but it was understood. Years later, the records still existed in parallel. The missing person was listed as last seen at multiple times in multiple locations, all supported by legitimate data sources. None of those moments could be conclusively identified as the final one. The systems did not argue with each other. They simply continued to report what they had always reported. No further evidence emerged, no remains were found, no explanation surfaced that could account for the overlapping timestamps without dismissing authenticated records. The disappearance remained unresolved, not because of a lack of information, but because of too much information that refused to align. In the end, the case was not defined by what was missing, but by what could not be reconciled. The records insisted on precision, the investigation required certainty, neither could accommodate the other. The file remains accessible today. It appears complete, it appears official, and yet it cannot describe a single coherent sequence of events. According to the records, the disappearance happened more than once. According to reality, it could only have happened once. Both versions remain documented. Dispatch logs show a call that never officially happened. According to official dispatch records, the call came in just after 3:14 a.m. and moved through the system without delay. It was logged, routed, assigned, and cleared like thousands of others. The problem is that no one can confirm it ever happened. In 2011, Mark Ellison was 37 years old and employed as a records analyst for a county communications center in central Ohio. His job was administrative, not investigative, and he was not searching for anomalies. He was responsible for verifying that older dispatch data could be safely migrated into a statewide system. Mark reviewed records line by line, checking timestamps, clearance codes, and unit assignments for consistency. Errors mattered because once copied forward, they became permanent. He had learned that most problems came from missing digits or formatting issues. This record did not fit that pattern. The call was categorized as a welfare check on a rural roadway. It carried a standard priority level and a clearance code indicating officer arrival and assessment. Under county policy, that code could only be applied after confirmation from the responding unit. There was no such confirmation recorded anywhere. What stood out most was what the record lacked. There was no case number, no narrative summary, and no outcome description. A completed welfare check without documentation was considered administratively impossible. Mark initially assumed a technical error. He expanded the review window to include surrounding calls. Every entry before and after followed normal patterns. There were no system alerts, maintenance logs, or crash reports during that shift. The anomaly appeared isolated and precise. Mark examined the metadata attached to the call. The dispatcher ID belonged to an overnight operator scheduled at that console. The responding unit ID belonged to a deputy assigned to that patrol sector. Both identifiers matched active rosters from that night. The dispatcher listed was Linda Carver, age 49, with more than 20 years of experience handling overnight emergency calls. When Mark asked if she remembered the incident, she said she did not. She stated that a rural welfare check in freezing weather would usually be memorable. Linda kept handwritten notebooks for every shift. When she reviewed the notebook from that night, the time window around 3 a.m. contained no entry. She told Mark she rarely failed to document a call, even brief ones. The responding unit belonged to Deputy Aaron Mills, 32 years old at the time, assigned to the northern rural sector. Aaron confirmed he worked that shift and remembered nothing unusual. He described the night as quiet and routine. Aaron allowed Mark to review his activity logs. They showed routine patrol movement and scheduled status checks. His cruiser GPS data showed no stop near the listed time. His vehicle camera system never activated. Mark escalated the issue to his supervisor. He was instructed to compare the county record against the state dispatch mirror. The state database contained the same call with identical timestamps and identifiers. It also lacked any report or narrative. At that point, Mark documented the anomaly formally. He noted that the call met every structural requirement of a legitimate dispatch event. Investigators later described it as a record that behaved correctly despite lacking context. County IT staff were consulted to determine whether the entry could have been generated by a system test. Test calls were automatically labeled and stored separately. This record followed live call formatting exactly and lacked any test designation. Another theory suggested a manual data entry error. However, the system automatically generated timestamps and identifiers. Audit logs showed no edits or overrides after the record was created. The entry appeared untouched. Attention then turned to dispatch audio. Calls from that period were archived on magnetic tape and later digitized. Mark requested the audio covering the full hour that included the anomaly. When technicians reviewed the recording, there was no audio corresponding to the call, there was no incoming tone, no dispatcher voice, and no background noise. The audio moved directly from the previous call to the next. Technicians reportedly found no evidence of tape damage or degradation. Typical failures produce static or distortion. This absence suggested the segment never existed. Investigators never confirmed how such a gap could occur. One explanation proposed that the call connected and disconnected too quickly to record audio. System documentation indicated that even dropped calls generated a brief marker. No marker was present. The explanation was dismissed. In 2012, an internal memo addressed the anomaly. The memo recommended leaving the record unchanged to preserve database integrity. Deleting or modifying it could create discrepancies across county and state systems. The call was labeled unresolved. Years passed without further action. In 2019, a statewide consolidation of dispatch systems prompted another review. Automated integrity checks flagged the same call again. Analysts examined it manually. Archived notes from that review described the entry as structurally valid but unsupported by any external evidence. Required fields were complete, optional narrative fields remained empty, no linked records could be located. Investigators attempted to trace the incoming call source. County file from 2009 showed that trunk lines used at the time did not preserve caller identification data. The originating number was never recorded. Analysts reviewed historical carrier summaries. These records showed aggregate call volume but no call level detail. Investigators never confirmed whether the call originated from a landline or a mobile phone. Some locals later claimed there were rumors about that winter night. According to these accounts, emergency lights were allegedly seen near a tree line along a rural road. The lights were reportedly visible only briefly. Investigators documented those claims but found no supporting evidence. There were no accident reports, medical dispatches, or towing records matching the description. Road maintenance logs showed no cleanup activity. Weather records confirmed freezing temperatures and light snowfall that night. Road conditions were slick but passable. Patrol advisories from that shift contained no warnings or incident notes. Dispatcher scheduling records confirmed Linda Carver was logged into her console at the exact minute of the call. System diagnostics showed no unauthorized access. Her activity before and after appeared routine. Deputy Mills's radio logs contained no reference to a welfare check. His equipment showed no unexplained data gaps. There was no indication that any response occurred. By 2020, Mark Ellison had left county employment. In his exit interview, he mentioned the unresolved call as the strangest record he encountered. The comment was noted without follow-up. The dispatch entry still exists in the consolidated database today. It remains categorized as a completed welfare check. Each audit flags it, and each review concludes there is insufficient evidence to amend it. No missing person report from the county matches the time or general location. Hospitals reported no unidentified admissions. Coroner records show no related cases. Investigators emphasize there is no proof of misconduct or hidden incident. The anomaly exists entirely within administrative data. The records confirm each other while offering no explanation. According to the system, the call was received, dispatched, and cleared without issue. According to every person involved, it never happened at all. Both records remain official. During the 2019 review, analysts discussed whether the record should be marked as invalid. Archive notes show the proposal was rejected. The system required a specific failure condition to invalidate a call. No such condition could be identified. One analyst noted that the call passed every automated integrity check. Timestamps aligned correctly, routing paths matched live traffic patterns, clearance codes corresponded to active units on duty. The record behaved exactly like a legitimate event. Because of this, the call could not be removed without manual intervention. Manual intervention required justification supported by documentation. Investigators had no documentation to justify the change. The record, therefore, remained unchanged. State auditors reviewed the issue and reached the same conclusion. According to archive notes, the anomaly did not meet criteria for escalation. It represented a conflict between data validity and contextual absence. That category had no corrective procedure. Training manuals from that period were consulted. They confirmed dispatchers were instructed to document every welfare check outcome. No exception existed for brief or uneventful responses. Investigators never confirmed whether informal deviations occurred during overnight shifts. Linda Carver was contacted again during the later review. She repeated that she had no recollection of the call. She also stated that clearing a welfare check without notes would have been against her professional habit. Deputy Mills was also contacted again. He stated that rural welfare checks often involve vehicles on the roadside. Those interactions usually required at least a brief stop. His logs showed no such stop that night. Analysts examined radio transmission logs more closely. Every recorded transmission corresponded to a documented call. There were no unidentified transmissions near the time in question. No packet loss was detected. A final hypothesis suggested the call may have been initiated internally and cleared immediately. However, internal calls were coded differently and flagged for review. This record carried no internal designation. By 2021, the anomaly was referenced in internal documentation as an example of unresolved data persistence. It was cited during training sessions for new analysts. No solution was proposed. The call continues to appear during routine integrity scans. Each time, it is flagged and reviewed. Each time, the conclusion remains the same. The record is valid and unsupported. There has never been a request from law enforcement to reopen the matter. No legal inquiry references the call. No public records request mentions it. Outside the database, it remains invisible. Investigators emphasize that the system shows no sign of manipulation. There is no evidence of deletion attempts or unauthorized access. The anomaly exists without motive or traceable action. The record remains frozen in its original state. It has not changed since it was first created. Every copy across county and state systems matches exactly. In official summaries, the call is described as unresolved but non-actionable. The language avoids speculation. No cause is assigned. It is treated as an administrative artifact. The call exists only as information. It cannot be tied to a person, a confirmed location, or a verified event. It satisfies every technical requirement while failing every contextual one. For auditors, it represents a limit of verification. The system confirms itself, nothing outside the system agrees, no conclusion can be reached. According to official records, the call happened. According to every witness and archive outside the system, it did not. Both remain equally documented. The dispatch logs still show a completed call. No evidence exists to explain it. No authority can remove it. It remains an emergency response that only exists on paper. What happened inside this sealed hospital wing will shock you. The locked third floor of the West Wing held a forgotten secret for many decades. This true story follows the documented events leading up to the unexpected sealing of the area. It involves a single patient and the baffling circumstances surrounding their sudden, dramatic exit from the records. In the summer of 1987, Arthur Pendleton was a meticulous hospital archivist. He worked at the stately St. Jude's General Hospital in a quiet corner of the city. Arthur was 55 years old and a career employee devoted to organizing decades of brittle medical records. His main goal that day was simple but tedious, as he needed to track down the historical blueprints for the old West Wing structure. Management planned a huge renovation and demanded to see the original floor plans from the 1940s construction. They fully expected the information to be located deep in the dusty sub-basement of the main administration building. Arthur had been in the basement archives for hours when he found a peculiar, bound ledger hidden behind a loose shelf panel. It was a patient transfer log from the late 1953 era that seemed out of place. This ledger was not logged in the central index and appeared to be deliberately hidden within a stack of junk filing material. The ledger detailed a single, highly unusual transfer from the new East Wing to the West Wing's third floor. This was odd, since the third floor had been completely decommissioned and sealed just a few months prior to that date. The record showed the patient was a 32-year-old man named James Calder. Arthur kept the ledger and made a clean copy of the entry for James Calder as a precautionary measure. The paper trail ended abruptly with that cryptic entry and offered no other information about the man. He found no corresponding discharge papers or a death certificate recorded in the main hospital database for patient Calder. James Calder had apparently vanished without a trace after being moved into the sealed and empty wing with no other witnesses. The original construction blueprints finally surfaced later that afternoon, but Arthur could not shake his troubling discovery. He started comparing the faded blueprints to the sealed-off third floor's electrical diagrams in his small office. He noticed a minor discrepancy involving a single, heavy-duty electrical service box on the third floor. The box was located along the west corridor where patient Calder was reportedly taken. This electrical service box had not been properly disconnected when the rest of the floor was shut down and isolated. Arthur's job usually involved ink and paper, but now he was looking at a dark, confusing puzzle that made him feel very uneasy. A hospital maintenance engineer named Marcus Vaughn confirmed the sealed wing was never supposed to have any active power at all. Marcus was an overworked but reliable man in his mid-30s who had a reputation for honesty and thorough work. Marcus reluctantly agreed to help Arthur conduct a very quiet and unsanctioned investigation late that night after his scheduled shift ended. The two men accessed the third floor through a utility elevator that still reached the landing but was normally locked down with a chain. The elevator doors opened onto a dim, low-ceiling lobby, smelling faintly of rust and old cigarette smoke. The thick, steel fire door to the west wing was not locked with a key. It was sealed instead with a heavy lead bar and a dated brass padlock attached to the doorframe. They quickly realized that the original door was intended to be permanently sealed using the new bar and lock as a final, urgent measure. Archived calls later showed the lock had only been installed days after James Calder's recorded transfer. Marcus used a portable cutting torch to quickly sever the heavy lead bar in the empty hall. He managed the cut and seal in less than a minute, leaving a scorch mark. Inside, the wing was instantly silent and felt much colder, reeking heavily of dust and a strange metallic chemical odor. Everything looked exactly as it had in the 1950s, covered in a thick layer of undisturbed grime and filth. They could clearly see an old water cooler and some chairs still sitting in the main hall waiting for people who would never arrive. The first thing they checked was the inexplicable active electrical box in the corridor near room 320. Arthur used his digital camera to document the area, snapping photos of the aged and decaying hospital hallway and the mysterious electrical service box. Marcus found that the service box was indeed live and feeding power to an unknown separate circuit somewhere further down the hall. Following the heavy-gauge wire from the service box led them to a supply closet near the patient rooms. They found the door had been heavily modified with newer steel plating and a complicated mechanical deadbolt. The walls around the door had fresh, unaged mortar, suggesting a very recent construction project compared to the rest of the old hospital wing. They knew someone had recently been there. Marcus quickly picked the complex lock, and they cautiously entered the small supply closet. Inside was not a closet, but a small secondary security anteroom. The walls were lined with sound-dampening acoustic panels, and one solid steel door led to an inner back room. They found a few discarded items in this outer space on a makeshift table made from stacked boxes. There was an old, heavy-duty reel-to-reel tape recorder, and several spools of magnetic tape, all clearly labeled with the single patient name, J. Calder. Marcus placed one of the tapes onto the reel recorder and quickly pressed the play button. The tape contained an unnerving and repetitive sound of constant, extremely high-frequency electronic ringing. It sounded like an old television with no signal or a dying telephone. A low, desperate voice occasionally cut through the piercing ringing noise. The voice was clearly Patient Calder, repeating the phrase, "I see colors," over and over again in a strained, fearful whisper. Then a different, calm voice would respond with something like, "The treatment is working, James." The calm voice sounded exactly like Dr. Elias Finch, a hospital researcher who died in a strange house fire years later in another state. Arthur felt a deep chill travel down his spine at the sound of the high-frequency noise. They quickly opened the final steel door and walked into the small room where the strange, unnerving sound was being generated. It was a heavily shielded patient room that was completely bare except for a single chair bolted to the floor in the center. The chair was wired with strange, homemade electrical components and heavy leather restraints that were well worn. On the wall, across from the chair, was a crude, hastily painted mural of swirling, bright, and impossible colors. Witness statements later reported that James Calder was terrified of bright colors after his military service due to a severe flash burn incident. This was his greatest fear on display. Arthur found a small, handwritten note stuck to the back of the bolted patient chair with old adhesive tape. The note was from Dr. Finch to an unnamed colleague dated December of 1953. It briefly explained that Patient Calder was being kept alive with continuous low-voltage electrical impulses from the specialized circuit. The sole goal was to train the patient to see the bright colors without experiencing extreme terror. The treatment was considered a promising and groundbreaking form of aversion therapy in the 1950s using electric shock. It was a terrifying form of old medicine, but the treatment had clearly failed years ago and had been completely abandoned by the main hospital staff. Patient Calder's panic response had somehow physically manifested into the constant high-pitched ringing on the tapes. That ringing was a constant auditory expression of his ongoing, profound terror and suffering. James Calder was never discharged or transferred from St. Jude's General Hospital. He was simply sealed into that room where his useless treatment continued running on the isolated electrical circuit for 34 years. The shock came from the second-to-last line of Dr. Finch's note to his research associate. It stated that the small patient room was actually the original air conditioning condenser closet for the West Wing. He had simply painted the brightly colored mural over the main air return vent in the wall. The hospital never had to worry about him escaping. His panicked, terrifying ringing noise was not a recording, but a constant, living sound. It was quietly being vented throughout the entire West Wing's ductwork for over 3 decades of silence. It had been the sealed wing's secret all along. Arthur and Marcus cut the electrical service box with a quick flick of the main switch, and the horrible ringing immediately stopped. They left the hospital that morning with no proof other than the copied ledger and the brief, unsettling witness statements they had documented. The original notes from Dr. Finch were lost when the two men abandoned the room in a panic, but the hospital finally demolished the sealed West Wing several years later as originally planned. The bizarre, terrifying case of James Calder became a quiet cautionary tale among the city's seasoned electricians and HVAC contractors who were asked to complete the demolition job. 3 lost hikers' final route was logged on a broken GPS. The search for the 3 lost hikers concluded tragically in the autumn of 2023 when their damaged GPS unit was finally recovered. It contained an incomplete route log that showed their desperate final movements over a 72-hour period. The trail of evidence only deepened the puzzle of how 3 experienced climbers vanished just miles from a well-maintained logging road. The missing group consisted of 2 brothers and their climbing guide. The brothers were 40-year-old finance manager David Chen and his 37-year-old younger brother Michael. They had hired 32-year-old guide Rebecca Hale, a local expert with over a decade of experience in the remote Sierra Blanca wilderness. Their original plan was a simple 5-day ascent of the remote west ridge of Mount Corwin, a known but challenging peak. They logged their intended route with the park rangers and were due to check in on a Sunday afternoon. The search was launched on Monday morning when the group failed to make contact and a sudden early blizzard rolled into the mountains. Search and rescue teams immediately began combing the planned route, but found no sign of the hikers. After a week of intense searching yielded nothing, the weather finally cleared and a park ranger spotted a flash of bright color off the planned trail. It was Rebecca Hale's orange backpack snagged high on a rock outcropping. The backpack was mostly empty except for a large rock hammer, a frayed length of climbing rope, and a single cracked Garmin GPS unit. The GPS unit's screen was completely shattered, and the external casing was heavily damaged by blunt force trauma. The internal battery had also died, but the flash memory chip was miraculously intact. The lead investigator, Captain Elias Thorne of the Sheriff's Department, immediately sent the unit to the forensics lab for data extraction. The technicians managed to recover a partial route log showing the group's movements up until the unit was damaged and stopped recording. The recovered log confirmed the group had been following their pre-planned ascent route for the first 2 days of the hike. The final 72 hours of data, however, showed a dramatic and inexplicable deviation. Instead of continuing the climb toward the summit, the group abruptly turned and began moving rapidly downhill away from the mountain. The route log showed a frantic, meandering path through a thick, trackless forest and into a confusing labyrinth of narrow canyons. The timestamps showed they had been moving almost continuously, covering ground at a grueling pace, barely stopping to rest, even at night. Their speed indicated they were not lost. They appeared to be actively fleeing something. The final recorded point placed them less than 5 miles from the main, well-traveled logging road, which made their continued disappearance even more baffling. They should have reached the road and found help long before the blizzard hit the area. Captain Thorne immediately organized a new search based on the GPS unit's final logged coordinates. The search team reached the last recorded location and found the terrain exactly as the GPS indicated. It was a steep, heavily wooded ravine leading to a wide, open clearing. In the center of the clearing, the team found a hastily constructed, crude shelter made of broken branches and rocks. It was clearly abandoned and contained no sign of the 3 hikers. Inside the shelter, the team found a small, waterproof journal belonging to David Chen, the older brother. The last entry was dated 2 days after the GPS stopped recording and was scribbled frantically in the margins of a blank page. The final sentences were almost illegible, but suggested a profound sense of terror. David wrote about an unusual repeating sound and the constant presence of something that followed them but was never directly seen. He mentioned that Michael, his younger brother, had been hearing the sound for over a day before the other 2 noticed it. The journal confirmed the group had been hiding in the woods near the shelter. David also referenced a disagreement with Rebecca, the guide, over how to escape the unseen threat. Rebecca had insisted on staying put, arguing the unseen thing could not follow them into the dense forest, but the brothers insisted on fleeing downhill toward the logging road. The journal ended with a final, desperate line about following Michael, who had reportedly run out into the open clearing. Captain Thorne went back to the forensic lab report on the cracked GPS unit. The technicians had also retrieved the corrupted internal memory file, which contained the system error log. The log showed the GPS unit's antenna had been jammed by a massive localized radio frequency interference a few hours before the unit was struck and shattered. The report noted the frequency was a highly unusual band, not typically used for civilian communications. Thorne realized the sound David Chen wrote about in his journal was almost certainly the high-pitched whine of the radio frequency interference that jammed the GPS. But the signal was highly localized and should have only affected the GPS unit. Michael, however, was hearing the sound before the GPS failed. Thorne immediately started researching the effects of high-frequency radio waves on the human auditory system. He discovered that certain rare individuals, typically young adult males, can experience a highly localized high-frequency sound known as the Frey effect when exposed to powerful pulsed microwave radiation. The effect is caused by a rapid thermal expansion of the inner ear tissue when exposed to the radiation. The effect is sometimes described as a loud, high-pitched clicking, or a constant, sharp ringing that only the affected person can hear. The sound is not real and cannot be recorded by a normal microphone. The final piece of the puzzle came from an archived local newspaper clipping found in the park office dating back to the late 1970s. It detailed a decommissioned, ultra-secret Cold War-era military relay station built high on the west ridge of Mount Corwin. The station, a prototype military communications hub, was shut down after a documented technical failure during an atmospheric testing project. The power was never fully disconnected. The decommissioned relay station was built directly on the ridgeline that the hikers had initially been climbing, and the entire structure was still encased in steel and concrete. Captain Thorne realized the climbers had accidentally walked too close to the source of the intermittent high-frequency radiation. Michael Chen, the younger brother, was an early victim of the strange, continuous sound, causing him to become erratic and panicked. The sound drove him to run from the shelter and out into the clearing, followed by David. Rebecca, the experienced guide, knew the area intimately and would have instinctively avoided the well-known but unmarked military testing zone. She had tried to keep the brothers in the shelter to shield them from the signal, but they insisted on fleeing downhill towards safety. The final route log showed their escape, their panicked downhill retreat, while being relentlessly pursued by a non-existent sound only one of them could hear. The search teams finally found the three hikers 3 days later, miles off the logged route and huddled together at the bottom of a shallow ravine. They had all succumbed to a combination of hypothermia and exhaustion. They had never been lost. They had simply been running in a panic from a sound that only one person could truly hear. The signal from the broken military relay station was briefly activated during the unexpected blizzard, causing the localized Frey effect that ultimately drove the three experienced hikers to their tragic final route. You can't outrun the fog that followed them. The desolate stretch of coastal highway was infamous among locals for sudden, blinding, and dangerous weather shifts. Drivers frequently reported that the thick gray mist could appear from nowhere and swallow cars whole. The road wound dangerously along the steep cliffs that overlooked the churning and dark Pacific Ocean below. It was on this lonely road that a 34-year-old courier named Corbin Vance vanished. Corbin was a reliable driver who had worked the graveyard shift for a logistics company for years. He was transporting a secure shipment of computer server components worth nearly $80,000 that night. The date was October 14th in the year 2012, a calm and clear Tuesday night. The initial setup for his disappearance seemed entirely routine, according to the dispatch logs and GPS data. Corbin checked in with his dispatcher at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning from a gas station. He reported that the sky was clear and the moon was bright enough to see the water. He purchased a large black coffee and a pack of gum before getting back into his van. The security camera at the station showed him looking relaxed and humming along to the station radio. There was absolutely no indication that he was worried or that he felt he was being followed. He pulled out of the station and turned north onto the empty highway toward the distant city. The incident began approximately 40 minutes later when Corbin made a frantic call to the dispatch center. The operator reported that Corbin sounded breathless and terrified as he spoke about the weather changing instantly. He claimed that a wall of dense white fog had just rolled over his vehicle from behind. "It's not natural. It is moving faster than I can drive," he shouted over the radio static. The operator tried to calm him down and asked him to pull over if visibility was zero. Corbin yelled back that he could not stop because there was something inside the fog with him. The call cut out abruptly with the sound of screeching tires and a loud metallic crunching noise. The complication arose when the first responders arrived at the GPS location roughly 20 minutes later. The highway was completely clear of fog, and the night sky was filled with bright stars. They found Corbin's delivery van parked haphazardly on the soft shoulder of the road near the guardrail. The engine was still idling quietly, and the headlights were cutting through the clear darkness of the night. The driver's side door was wide open, and the interior cabin light was flickering on and off. Corbin Vance was nowhere to be found, and his cell phone was lying on the asphalt. Detective Silas Reed was assigned to the case the following morning after the strange initial report filed. Reed was a veteran investigator who had seen plenty of accidents on that dangerous stretch of road. He assumed initially that Corbin had hit a deer and perhaps fallen over the cliff in shock. He ordered a massive search and rescue operation to comb the rocky shoreline hundreds of feet below. The search teams spent 3 days scanning the cliffs and the water, but found absolutely nothing. There was no body, no torn clothing, and no sign that anyone had gone over the edge. The investigation shifted when Detective Reed began to look closer at the van and the cargo inside. The back doors of the van were still locked, and the expensive computer servers were completely untouched. This immediately ruled out a simple robbery or a hijacking gone wrong as a primary motive. Reed turned his attention to the vehicle's mechanical computer and the recorded data from the engine block. The data showed that Corbin had been driving at erratic speeds for 3 minutes before stopping abruptly. He had accelerated to nearly 90 miles per hour on a road rated for only 45. Detective Reed requested the raw audio files from the dispatch center to analyze the background noise deeper. He sat in a quiet room and listened to Corbin's terrified voice over and over again on loop. He noticed a strange, low-frequency humming sound that was audible just beneath the sound of the engine. It sounded mechanical and rhythmic, like a large industrial fan or a powerful ventilation system running hard. This sound did not match the profile of any standard vehicle engine or natural wind noise. Reed sent the audio file to a state forensic audio specialist for a more detailed spectral analysis. The specialist reported back 2 days later with a finding that changed the entire scope of the case. The background noise contained a specific frequency signature that matched a high-output military-grade smoke generator. This was not natural sea fog that Corbin had encountered on that lonely stretch of coastal highway. Someone had deliberately deployed a massive chemical smokescreen to blind the driver and force him to stop. Reed realized that the fog that chased Corbin was actually a weaponized cloud used for concealment. The question remained why they would do this if they did not steal the valuable cargo. Reed went back to the witness reports from that night to see if anyone saw another vehicle. A long-haul trucker named Arlene Pyle had passed through that sector around 2:15 that morning. She reported seeing a large, matte black, modified box truck parked on a fire access road nearby. She told the detective that the truck had strange pipes mounting on the rear bumper facing outward. Arlene thought it was a road maintenance vehicle, spraying for weeds or conducting some night repair work. The truck had no reflective markings, no license plate, and no company logo visible on the side. Detective Reed pulled the traffic camera footage from the toll booth 30 miles south of the incident. He scanned hours of video until he found a graining image of the black truck Arlene described. The truck passed the toll booth at 1:30 in the morning, trailing Corbin's van by distance. Reed zoomed in on the image and noticed the driver was wearing heavy tactical goggles and a mask. This was a sophisticated, organized crew that had targeted Corbin for a specific reason unknown to police. Reed theorized that the cargo was a decoy and Corbin himself was the actual target. The investigation deepened when Reed looked into Corbin's past employment before he became a delivery driver. He discovered that Corbin had worked briefly as a security consultant for a private armored car firm. He had been fired 3 years prior for raising concerns about a vulnerability in their routing software. The firm had dismissed his claims as paranoia and let him go with a small severance package. Reed contacted the firm and learned that they had suffered a massive theft just 2 days ago. The thieves had used a weather event to obscure cameras while they robbed a facility in Seattle. Reed connected the dots and realized the crew needed Corbin's biometric data to unlock the routing system. They didn't need the servers in his van. They needed his fingerprints and his retinal scan. The fog was used to capture him without any satellite or traffic cameras recording the abduction event. The black truck with the smoke generator allowed them to create their own cover anywhere they wanted. Reed issued a multi-state alert for the modified black box truck and the missing driver immediately. He described the suspects as highly dangerous and equipped with military-grade diversionary technology and tactical gear. The breakthrough came a week later when a state trooper spotted the black truck in a warehouse district. The truck was parked behind a derelict factory that had been closed since the year 2008. Reed and a SWAT team surrounded the building and moved in with extreme caution and precision. They found the truck inside the warehouse, still smelling faintly of the chemical fog agent used. In the back office of the warehouse, they found Corbin Vance bound to a chair but alive. He was dehydrated and terrified, but he had not given up the final encryption keys yet. The twist revealed itself when they processed the suspects arrested at the scene of the warehouse raid. The leader of the crew was the very same manager who had fired Corbin 3 years earlier. The manager had orchestrated the thefts and realized he needed Corbin's old access codes to finish the job. He knew Corbin's route and had built the fog truck specifically to trap him on the coast. The fog was a terrifying psychological weapon designed to make the abduction look like a tragic accident. The manager planned to throw the van off the cliff after they extracted the necessary data. The payoff was the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen property from the manager's previous heists. Corbin Vance was reunited with his family and eventually sued the security firm for millions in damages. The black truck with the smoke machine was impounded and studied by federal authorities for its ingenuity. The fog that followed Corbin was not a ghost or a weather phenomenon, but human greed. Detective Reed retired a year later, finally satisfied that he had solved the riddle of the mist. The coastal highway remained dangerous, but at least one unnatural predator had been removed from the road. The case of the man who was chased by the fog became a local legend instantly. It reminded everyone that sometimes the most impossible threats have the most grounded and human explanations. Corbin never drove that stretch of Highway 101 again for the rest of his life. He found a quiet desk job in a city far away from the ocean and the mist. But every time the weather turned gray, he likely remembered the white wall that chased him down. It was a silent warning that you can never truly outrun the past or the truth.